Okay, I'll be talking soon with Donald Robertson, who is a world-renowned psychotherapist. He's also the author of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, Build Your Resilience, Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. He's had decades experience in cognitive behavior therapy. Personally, he's my favorite teacher of Stoicism. He teaches it so practically and beneficial, and probably because of his background in therapy. He's also an expert in anxiety and on the topic of anxiety, which I'm excited to ask him questions about anxiety because it's something I've struggled with a lot of my life. I'm speaking to him because he's recently wrote a book called How to Think Like Socrates, which is like this book, but on Socrates. And honestly, it's one of the best books I've ever read. I've learned so much about Socrates and about myself and how to improve as a character because Socrates has been called the godfather of self-help. And this book just proves why he's called the godfather of self-help. So I'm excited for this talk to ask him questions. The last time I spoke with Donald about a year ago, we spoke for 3 hours on Stoicism and self-help. So I'm expecting something similar. I'm really excited for this. I've got a lot of questions on my mind already, but we'll see how it goes. I don't like writing things down because I feel like it gets in the way of the questions. So these are all just things off the top of my head after reading his book, which I only just recently finished, and just things I want help with because, Donald Robertson's like, imagine ChatGPT had studied philosophy and self-help their whole life, and they'd been teaching patients and clients their whole life, helping people practically, and they really care about someone. Imagine that's ChatGPT, and you can just type in whatever question you want. Donald comes with the perfect answer. So I'm hoping to benefit a lot from this personally and learn a lot about myself, which I know you will just learn so much. But the main premise of this is to talk about Socrates and the things I heard in his book and read in his book, because he's called the godfather of self-help, which is interesting. I hope you enjoy. Okay, it does say for me actually that it's
Oh, you
recording.
saw it? Okay, cool.
Yeah, but I think the reason your book works so well is you get a sense like normal self help, like a self help book. You get told something, and then you just have to take it as like this is what I'm being told. But when you're putting it into context of like the life of Socrates or the life of Marcus Aurelius, it means so much more. Like when he's talking about death, and then you hear in his struggles with death, and then leading up to his death, it makes the advice actually seem real.
It's interesting, because logically, I wonder should it make that much difference if we connect it to the life of a historical individual? But I know that people feel that it does, and like we were just saying, it came as a big surprise to me, and I think to my publisher because it's an unusual thing to combine historical anecdotes and self-help and philosophy like this, and we weren't really sure that people would take to it. Whereas now, not only do we know there's a lot of people that really enjoy reading this kind of combination of things, there's also, I think, particular types of individual that are kind of drawn to it. And the other interesting thing about it is a lot of the people that read How to Think Like a Roman Emperor were people that never read self-help books, because it's a little bit of a closed thing in a way. People that read self-help books buy more and more of them, and there's some people that just aren't into that kind of thing and never read it at all. But so it's unusual to write a book that reaches a whole new demographic with self-help advice, because they came for the kind of history and stuff, but they kind of enjoyed the self-help, and it was more novel to them because they hadn't read any stuff like that before. So I'm quite pleased with the way it's worked out. And I hope, I mean, you said it works. Like, I hope the Socrates book works in a similar way. As an author, it's not the only thing that you have to go on, but one of the main things you have to go on is just your own kind of taste or instinct. And so I always just write books that I think I wish someone had written a book like this for me when I was like 17. I kind of imagine going back in time and if I'd read How to Think Like Socrates, I would have thought it was awesome. I'd be like, this is exactly the kind of book that I want to read. And you just have to kind of cross your fingers and think, I hope there's enough people out there like 17-year-old me or like even like me now who have similar tastes. But it looks like I think there are. In the story of Socrates, the other odd thing about classics is when you study the classics, I think everyone has this experience. You read things and you think, well, this this is really awesome. Maybe it takes a little bit of effort to kind of get there, like reading Shakespeare or something. Like at first you think it might be inaccessible, but once you study it and you get used to the language, you start to really appreciate it, or like appreciating classical music. But with classical Greek and Roman literature, it's the same. It takes a little bit of effort, and then you get into it, and then you think there's like an amazing story here, and how come there isn't a movie about this, and how come there's not a movie about Alcibiades? Like I saw someone say that on the internet the other day, some classicist. Um, it's true. Like, I mean, but if you have that feeling of thinking there should be a movie about this is an amazing story, right? It's often because it's difficult to tell, it's too complicated, or there's some debate about certain details of it. And I had that frustration with the story of Socrates. I thought this is the most amazing story in the history of philosophy. He's like the most inspiring and complex character, and I loved it. But I thought I find it hard to tell other people about this story because there's several obstacles in the way of retelling it. It's a little bit of a complex story, and there's bits of it where we have conflicting evidence, or there's ambiguities. And so eventually I thought, suppose I was making a movie of this or doing a graphic novel, I would just have to kind of bite the bullet and say, we're going to have to fill in some gaps. We're going to have to combine some characters together. We're going to have to resolve some ambiguities, we're going to have to make some educated guesses. But by doing that, within reason, we can make this into a coherent narrative. And it's close enough to the original that it's plausible. It's firmly grounded in the historical sources. And I think people will then have a stronger sense of who Socrates was, and hopefully they then will be able to appreciate his philosophy a lot more.
I mean, after reading your book, I feel like I know Socrates. The stories are so in depth and sort of, I don't know. He's like, to me, I went in not knowing too much about Socrates, and now I find him quite a charming guy, and quite I don't know, very interesting. And
Yeah.
it's like you said, like, if I knew anything about Socrates, I would have said, I wish someone wrote a book like this. But this is kind of my introduction into Socrates, and I feel like I know enough. One thing that is sort of on my mind, and I need this clearing up, is I don't know how to phrase this, but do you have a problem with self-help?
Do I have a problem with self-help? I guess I have criticisms of
Oh,
self-help.
criticisms, yeah. I
Yes.
didn't know how to phrase it, but
Yeah, I do have a problem. I guess, in a sense, I have a problem with self-help.
okay.
And then
What is that
your
problem?
follow-up question is, what is that problem? Like, so there's a couple of different ways I could answer that. The best way to answer a question usually is in a slightly roundabout way. As a therapist, most psychotherapists will tell you, at least cognitive behavioral therapists, that in the initial phase of treatment, when you're assessing clients, you'll find that they have many coping strategies, or rules that they follow that they're convinced are helpful, that are actually perpetuating their problem.
Quick interruption, and then we'll get straight back to the lesson. This will be 10 seconds, but I just want to say that today's lesson was powered by Huel, which is a product that I personally recommend and a product that I personally consume. If you want to learn more about Huel, then wait till the end of the video. Back to it.
Right. I'll give you a really trite, silly example of it. But these examples only ever seem silly if you're not the one with the problem, right? So I could take examples from some of my clients and tell them to other clients, and they'll be like, "That's ridiculous. Who would ever believe that?" Right? But they're all just coming from other clients. Like, so there's always somebody that actually buys into this. So the most obvious example would be caffeine, right? I think almost every client, possibly every client I've ever seen that has insomnia, drinks loads of coffee, right? And I ask every client about their caffeine intake, and or I used to anyway. Like, so I would say, how much coffee do you drink, and what form does it take, and stuff. And I think if I drank that much coffee, I'd have problems getting to sleep as well, right? So I say, why do you drink so much coffee? And they say, well, because I have to, because I've got insomnia. I feel really tired all the time. I have to drink gallons of coffee to get through the day, right? Because I'm not sleeping, which seems crazy, right? Because you might think, but hang on a minute, it's probably because you're drinking all the coffee that you're having problems sleeping, right? It's circular, right? Clearly. Um, but many problems that people experience are like that. And so sometimes these are strategies that clients have come up with themselves, but often they're like self-help strategies that they've got off the internet or from self-help books. And the reason there's a kind of problem here, and actually we're getting right into talking about something that's actually very profound. If this is really common, when clients come in into therapy, it's important to address it. Um, so there are, particularly say in the treatment of anxiety, which is my specialism, right? There are many things that you can do that will temporarily alleviate anxiety, right? The problem is that strategies that temporarily alleviate anxiety often make you more sensitized to it in the long term, right? Because the easiest way to cope with anxiety is through some form of avoidance or
Yeah.
distraction, for example. So, I mean, for instance, like people will often use distraction techniques to cope with anxiety or to manage pain, but that means that they're not then developing other, like, more constructive skills. Like the thing about avoidance is it robs you of the opportunity to figure out better, healthier ways of coping with a problem. Right? I mean, it would be like people that just avoid ever getting into any arguments or conflict with other people, right? Because they're like super avoidant of that. And you might think, but if you do that, you'll never figure out how to be assertive. You'll never figure out how to actually resolve problems with other people. It's very frustrating if you have to work with somebody who just avoids ever bringing up any like points of conflict or any controversial subjects, right? So self-help literature contains a lot of bad psychological advice, basically, because it often falls into the trap of recommending strategies that seem beneficial in the short term but contribute to a problem in the longer term. And that's just one problem. The other problem that I mentioned at the beginning of the book on Socrates is that, which is a little bit trickier to explain, there's this issue with rule governed behavior that we know about in modern behavior therapy in particular. So, long story short, often people will take a strategy or a rule that works quite well in one context, and then they'll apply it rigidly to situations where it no longer works. And not only will they do that once or twice, but they'll often continue doing it repeatedly, which is quite puzzling. Like, why would you keep doing something that's clearly not working anymore? When people acquire a role because it's been recommended to them from someone else, like where they learn it verbally and from a book or someone tells them, as opposed to they figure it out through trial and error learning, they tend to apply it more rigidly. This is what the research tells us, right? And so there's a problem with people getting life advice from self-help books where they'll be then prone to follow that advice rigidly in a way that's insensitive to changes in their environment. And what's good advice in one situation might be bad advice in another situation, right? So, for example, in the 70s, one of the big popular things was assertiveness training. And then that kind of was eclipsed by mindfulness and more acceptance based approaches. Now, you could say there's kind of a place for both. Like sometimes it's a good idea just to be more accepting of stress or conflict in a situation. And sometimes it's more important to try to do something to change it, like by being more assertive. But it depends on the situation, right? So a healthy mindset would be one where you adapt and you think, this in this situation I need to put up a fight, and be quite firm and quite assertive. In this situation I'd be better just to zip it, and learn to accept the uncertainty or to accept the conflict. It's not worth fighting every single battle, but you need to be able to switch between these alternative ways of coping. Research on coping with stress shows that people who are able to move between different coping strategies adaptively are the ones that are most emotionally resilient. Whereas people that are one trick ponies and just have like one coping strategy and become overly dependent on it are often, can cope well with some situations, but not others.
I think that was me for a long time. It's still me, but is another problem. I think is kind of what you touched on with self help. Is say like I've struggled with anxiety most of my life, and if I'm going to look for help on social media and I see something that I know like pleases me, I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. Then
Uh-huh.
I've my bias towards that can be built off of my anxiety. So I'm shying away from things that might actually help. Sort of like you wrote in the book, Socrates is talking about a confectioner. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's just the people taking the sweet stuff, and maybe I'm taking the sweet advice because it appeals to me, but it's not actually the advice I need.
Yeah, I think this is a thing that seems to be more prevalent now than it was in the past. I noticed this I feel like everyone now is an autodidact. Like people learn stuff from YouTube videos and things like that. And so we're becoming, I think, more passive in our learning. Like I meet people now that know quite a lot about philosophy, but they've mainly learned it just from reading books and watching videos, right? And there's nothing wrong inherently with that, but there's stuff missing from it. It's not the whole story. So when you do a degree in philosophy, you engage in debates with people, you attend tutorials, you write papers and have them critiqued by your peers and stuff like that. And you have to learn to admit when you're wrong. And you have to be willing to have other people point out errors in your reasoning. And then you develop more of a skill for doing philosophy. Um, like if you're just memorizing stuff and repeating it, you're not really developing the ability to notice, accept, respond to flaws in your thinking. And so I think that's not a very healthy way of developing you, and it's painful. Like Socrates talks about this, that when somebody points out a fundamental mistake you've made about something that's really important to you, that's kind of a painful, it's an unpleasant experience, right? But if you think about it, it's healthy, right? We want to know when we're wrong about stuff, right? And I guess the difficulty with watching videos and just reading books and stuff is that it's not as challenging as that. It allows us just to kind of focus on stuff that we already agree with, in a sense. It's not sufficiently challenging to really make us change and grow as individuals, I think Socrates thought that was part of the problem with the sophists. People would just go along and listen to their speeches and then parrot what they'd said, but
Yeah.
they never really kind of allowed themselves to be criticized or questioned in depth to really put these ideas to the test properly.
Yeah, 'cause I noticed that a lot with Socrates in your book is I think he says a good friend will be frank, and he says it's maybe a blessing to be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think that's really interesting. I think it's a healthy mindset to adopt to kind of, would you say, seek these things?
Yeah. Like he says people are doing him a favor. Like he has this weird conversation with the sophists where obviously the whole point of the sophists was that they're all about winning debates. Like they teach people, they make money by training people how to win arguments. So Socrates is saying something really radical to these guys when he's saying, I prefer to lose arguments, right? Because it's the only way you learn anything. Like you guys assume it's better to win arguments, but you never grow as an individual. Like it's by losing the argument that you think, oh my God, I need to revise my whole worldview. This guy's just proven me wrong. And you actually kind of grow as an individual, and it's painful. But we should be tough enough intellectually to endure being disproven in that kind of way. I think some of these things resonate with me because also in psychotherapy, if you go and see a therapist and they just kind of massage your ego and agree with everything you say, sometimes what you find is clients will say they went to see a therapist and they maybe did this for years. And then eventually, though, they started to think, but I'm not getting anything out of this. It's not going anywhere, right? And so you'll see clients who say, I did this for years, and what I really decided I need now is somebody who's going to challenge me more and tell me things that I don't find comfortable, or tell me that I'm mistaken about certain things, or point out where I'm contradicting myself. So you'll often see people who have actually spent a lot of time and money, having this less challenging kind of approach to therapy, and they reach a point of frustration with like, okay, I get it now. I need somebody who's going to challenge me. And so Socrates, I can't really emphasize enough how, as a therapist, maybe I should have emphasized this more in the book. Like, the reason I think I write differently about Socrates is a psychotherapist in a sense, right? I really mean that. He astoundingly so. And so you can read the Socratic dialogues more from the perspective of psychotherapy. And there are many fundamental aspects about what he's doing that make more sense from that perspective and really resonate with like the experience of what it's like to work with clients. Realizing that it's you need sometimes to tell people things that they don't want to hear, like in order to actually benefit them.
So, would you describe this as the best form of self-help? Is to um,
Yeah,
seek, kind of seek to be wrong?
I think so. Like, I think that's part of it. It's not the whole story, but
Yeah.
that's a big part of it. There's a problem. Look, I mean, if you want me to kind of lean into this a bit, right?
Oh, and how
What?
how would you adopt this sort of mindset as well? Because I feel nearly everyone um, doesn't want to be wrong.
Right. Because let me see. Let me again kind of like answer it in a slightly roundabout way. The If you work as a therapist or a life coach or whatever, you'll meet endless people who probably the majority of my clients would describe themselves as kind of self-help junkies in a sense. I read loads of self-help books. I love self-help books, right? I like self-help books as much as the next guy. But like some of my clients, it amazes me, they've read even more than I have. And they've got like whole bookshelves, like libraries in their home filled with self-help books. They've done all these courses, watched all these videos, done all these training, and yet there's still some inescapable fact that's staring me right in the face as they're telling me all of this, which is they're in therapy or they're having coaching, right, for a problem that's still really driving them crazy. And so there's something puzzling about that. They've consumed loads of self-help of lots of different types over a long period of time, and yet they still end up in therapy because they're stuck, like, and struggling with something. And so often the people who consume the most self-help content are what people who don't really seem to be benefiting that much from it. And that's puzzling to them. And often they'll say, it feels like it is helping me, right? And the coach, the therapist might say, maybe in some ways it is, but like you still have the problem, right? You're still depressed, right? Or you're still having panic attacks or whatever. And that is what you're consuming all the self help to help you with. So is it pseudo self help? Maybe in a sense, it's not really having an impact, or not in a very obvious way on the problem that you're struggling with. Um, so is philosophy an alternative to that? How can we get beyond that? Well, I think the Socratic method really, what it teaches us to do is to question ourselves more deeply, right? To question our assumptions. And I think there are several aspects to that I talk about in the book. But one is simply, first of all, actually, I'd say maybe three things I'll pick out. One is that Socrates focuses on the most important things in life. That's how he phrases it, right? Which seems an odd thing to say, but even modern academic philosophers often don't really focus on the most important questions in life. Ancient philosophers seem to have been better at that in some ways. Like, they focus on what does fulfillment consist in? What is the goal of life? What does wisdom really consist in? These are questions that people kind of ignore. And actually, another criticism of self help would be self help techniques will sometimes focus on helping you to overcome painful emotions or helping you to achieve your goals, but it doesn't really help you to figure out what your goals are, right? So no, sometimes it does, but a lot of self-help doesn't help you to get that much clearer about what are the goals that you actually should be working towards anyway. And so there's something fundamentally missing there. But Socrates and ancient philosophers in general were much more concerned with helping us to figure out what is the point of all of this. What are you using the self help for? Like, what are you trying to do? What do you want your life to be about? What's your fundamental goal here? They thought that was the main question we have to answer. And then these other questions are kind of secondary to that. And then another important part of it is learning to question, to think outside the box, to use the horrible modern cliche, right? But to question our definitions of the virtues is a big part of what the Socratic method consists in. So Socrates will ask people to define justice, to define courage, to define wisdom, and then he'll brainstorm examples that conflict with their definition, right? I'll give you the most cliched example. He's speaking to some generals in a dialogue called The Lackeys, and he says, can you define what courage means? And courage is really important to generals, military commanders. And they define it as standing your ground. So another, basically staying in the phalanx formation. It's really important that you do that, right? It's the most familiar thing to them. But Socrates says, okay, that kind of makes sense. But what about if you're in the cavalry and then you don't stand your ground, then you charge at the enemy, right? Or what if you're fighting a tactical retreat? Surely courage during a tactical retreat would be different from just standing your ground. And also, what about the Spartans? They're really courageous, but they don't fight in that formation. Like, they charge into the enemy a bit more like cavalry do. Or what about in times of peace when you're not at war? Then surely you can still be courageous, but it wouldn't consist in standing your ground in the same way, right? So Socrates is brainstorming, he's actually thinking creatively to identify situations where this rule, like, or definition doesn't really work anymore. And we can train ourselves to do that. The simplest method he gives for skills training in that is this 2-column technique that he describes that no one ever mentions. He has a teaching aid that Xenophon, one of his students, tells us that Socrates used, where he would say, put some examples of justice in one column, right? And the other one column is headed justice, the other is headed injustice. And then ask yourself, in what situations, like, would this example potentially be moved over into the other column? So he says, what would be an example of injustice? And the guy he's talking to is a young man who's a self-help junkie, by the way, called Euthydemus. He has a library of books written by wise men. And Socrates says, he basically says, so you want to be someone who's just, who's moral. You're reading all these books about it, so you should be really clear about what justice is, right? And Euthydemus is kind of almost embarrassed to admit that he's confused about what justice is, even though he's read loads of books about it, right? Because he hasn't subjected himself to questioning. He hasn't questioned himself carefully enough, right? So Socrates says, let's draw these 2 columns. Injustice is one, the other one is headed justice. Give me examples of injustice. So they say, okay, stealing, lying, stuff like that. Socrates says, well, what about an elected general in warfare, like seizing the weapons of the enemy? Isn't that stealing? But is that unjust? And Euthydemus says, well, I guess technically that's not unjust, so we could move it to the other column, right? We could say that that's just because it's in warfare. What about lying to the enemy in a war? And Euthydemus says, okay, maybe lying to the enemy is just, like, we accept that as being appropriate, so we'd have to make an exception for that. So now your definition is becoming a little bit more nuanced. And Euthydemus says, well, then I'd revise my definition and say that justice consists in lying to your enemies but telling the truth to your friends. And Socrates says, okay, what if your friend is suicidal and he asks you where he's hidden his dagger? And you might say, well, okay, under that circumstance, like, it might be considered just to lie to him because you don't want him to harm himself. So even in some situations, maybe lying to your friend might be considered just. So Socrates is constantly helping people to notice these exceptions to the generalizations or the verbal rules or definitions that they're making. And it's forcing them to develop what we now call cognitive flexibility, to be able to see things from multiple perspectives rather than just getting tunnel vision and being trapped into one way of looking at it. It's not unlike processes that we use in modern cognitive therapy, basically, to encourage people to snap out of a kind of rigid mindset and to be more flexible, more adaptive in their thinking. But an important way of putting this is, I think some people in the ancient world believed, and I think many people today believe just by default, that wisdom would consist in knowing some stuff, a bunch of things, like just having a lot of true beliefs, for example, right? Um, whereas Socrates, to put it simply, views wisdom from a completely different perspective, I think. He sees it more as a cognitive skill. Like wisdom is an ability, not just like a bunch of stuff that you believe. I mean, so people thought that they could go and see the sophists, these self-proclaimed wise men, and they would give them a big elaborate speech about the nature of justice, and you just have to memorize it, right? And if you go away and kind of parrot that, then you're as wise as they are, right? Even if you can't really answer questions about it, and and Socrates would say it's not just memorizing the stuff and being able to parrot it makes you wise. It's a skill like that makes you wise. It's your ability to question things, to spot contradictions, right? It's you better to think of wisdom as a kind of process, basically, and as a skill that you're constantly having to develop by testing yourself. I think Socrates, in some ways, resembles Jimi Hendrix
Okay.
because, right, I really do.
I want to hear this.
Yeah, like because Jimi Hendrix used to wear his guitar all of the time. He famously used to go to bed and take his guitar with him and put it in the bed beside him. He'd go to the toilet wearing his guitar still strapped around his neck. He'd fry his eggs in the morning with his guitar still strapped on, right? So part of it is what psychologists call time on task, right? He was constantly playing around with his guitar. He was like never separated from it, right? Socrates, one of the striking things about the dialogues is the amount of time on task that he refers to. So Socrates didn't have a job, right? We believe he may have been a stonemason or sculptor. Like there's some of the sources that suggest that. There's some question about how reliable that version of it is. But you notice, so I that's one thing in the book that I wrote, I just accept that story, right? Whereas
Yeah.
if I was writing an academic history, I might say some of our sources say this. They're kind of later sources. It's debated, like whether this was actually what he did as a young man. Although, to be honest, I think his father probably must have had some kind of profession. Socrates was probably born into some kind of profession. It's plausible that he was a sculptor. But what was I going to say? He abandons that and he spends all of his time studying. And he says that he spends all day, every day, just doing philosophy. And he's not just sitting reading books. He's questioning people, questioning them, questioning them. And so one of the other things that I think helps him to develop this wisdom is that Socrates recognizes that we have a blind spot for our own biases. And this is another big problem with self-help, right? In order to help yourself, you have to be able to notice like what your biases are, what your weaknesses are. But we're not good at doing that. Like that's why people go and see life coaches and therapists. There's research that shows, for example, Igor Grossman, he's the head of a centre that does research on wisdom at the University of Waterloo, a psychologist. And his research is based on the observation that people, if we can quantify what wisdom looks like, being able to identify multiple perspectives on a problem, being good at finding compromises that combine several potential solutions. Like there's certain characteristics that we can kind of quantify in somebody's reasoning capacity. And what he found was that we exhibit more wisdom in our reasoning when we're discussing other people's problems than when we're discussing our own. Because when we try to analyze our own problems, we're biased, right? And so we're not very good at doing it. We lack perspective. It's easy for us to spot what other people are doing wrong, harder for us to spot it ourselves. And Socrates realizes that's partly why he thinks engaging in a dialogue with other people is so important, because he thinks the other person serves as a kind of mirror. Like by helping other people to figure out like the mistakes that they're making, and by observing their reasoning, we gain insight into the type of mistakes that we are probably guilty of making as well. We by learning to help other people, we become better at helping ourselves, because we have more objectivity, we have more perspective when we're looking at their problems. And then we realize they're just committing the same mistakes that we are, though. Like we're probably making some of those mistakes as well. Again, this is just something that I recognize in Socrates more easily coming from the perspective of a psychotherapist, because psychotherapists help people, every day when they're working. And then obviously most psychotherapists are just as kind of neurotic as anybody else, right? But over time, what you realize, you kind of go through stages. In the initial stage, you've got all the same problems as your clients, and you're not really able to benefit yourself as much as you might like. It's easier to help your clients with their problems. But eventually, you start to benefit from the fact that you're helping your clients, right? Because if you help depressed clients to spot the thinking patterns that are making them depressed, eventually you start to think, maybe I'm doing some of the things that this client's doing as well. And I can see how it's affecting him. And I can see the struggles that had to go through in order to snap out of this habit. But by helping him, it's given me some kind of insight into stuff that I was probably doing without fully appreciating it until now, right? He's a mirror for some of the same flaws that I have, in my own personality. So in a roundabout way, I think you benefit as a therapist from helping other people over time. And I think that Socrates seems to be aware of that. He refers to this idea, particularly in a dialogue by Plato called the First Alcibiades, where he really kind of explicitly describes this issue of using the other person as a mirror for our own soul.
Yeah, he says, in order to see one's own soul, you look into the soul of someone else. Is that right? There was a study by Grossman, I think you actually mention it in the book, about they had two groups. You'll be able to explain this, but they had two groups. One chose to see the problem as if it was a friend's problem, and then the others chose to see the problem as if it was theirs. Are you able to just explain that and sort of explain the results or the findings?
Yeah, so there are a number of different studies that Professor Grossman and his colleagues have done. He calls this distanced self-reflection, and one version of it is where you keep a journal and you describe, say, relationship problems. And so one group might describe them as you normally would in the first person. So I got annoyed with my wife or girlfriend because she said such and such. And the other group use a technique that's sometimes called Iliism, which consists in referring to your problems in the third person grammatically. So I would say, Donald got annoyed with his wife because she said such and such to him. So I describe it as if I'm describing someone else. And that technique alone seemed to cause people to exhibit more wisdom in their reasoning, as measured by the research tools that this group of researchers have. So the people were more able to figure out different ways of looking at the problem and to evaluate different solutions by phrasing it in the third person. This technique is already used in psychotherapy. Aaron T. Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, describes using a similar technique. Because I think Igor Grossman also reports research that arrives at a similar finding. But in clinical practice in CBT, it's been found that referring to distressing thoughts in the third person, in addition to improving our problem-solving ability and making us better at decision making and evaluating things, it also tends to reduce our distress. So if I say, I notice right now that Donald keeps telling himself nobody likes me, everybody hates me, or something like that, right? And so I'm now taking a step back and observing my own negative thinking. It becomes somewhat less depressing if I describe it in the third person, as if I'm watching myself have that thought, right? So there's a lot of modern psychotherapy encourages people to achieve this shift in perspective that we sometimes call cognitive distancing or cognitive diffusion. It's pretty integral to modern psychotherapy. There are a number of ways that we can do it, but one of them is to describe our thoughts in the third person. Now we start viewing our own thinking more objectively. I guess Beck describes it as if you imagine your depression or your anxiety is like a filter, it's like a bias. So normally, think of it as colored lenses that you're wearing, like red lenses or blue lenses. So you're just looking at the world through that filter. It affects everything that you see. But what would be more useful would be is if you could take those glasses off and look at them and evaluate the filter rather than evaluating the world through the filter. You want to evaluate the filter, right?
Yeah.
And that's what psychotherapists do. If you're wearing blue depressive glasses and you evaluate the world through that blue filter, a psychotherapist will be looking at you, evaluating the filter that you're wearing, and maybe suggesting that you could try another one, right? But with a bit more effort, we can learn to do that for ourselves, right? And one trick, one gimmick that helps us to do it perhaps is to describe what we're doing in the third person, using our own name and using pronouns like he and him.
Yeah, well, I always find it funny. People always give out advice to friends, and then when they go through the same problem, like a breakup or something,
Mm-hmm.
they don't take any of their own advice, and they fall through all the
Yeah.
same traps that their friend went through. And yeah, I guess it's just when you're actually in something, it's so much harder to be aware of the problem. I do think that that would be helpful, keeping a journal. I also think, I don't know if this would be advisable, but the more you can distance yourself from the idea, would it be useful to, if I wrote the journal, to use a different name and maybe leave it for a while, then come back to it, because then it's completely not attached. Well, it's still attached to me, but much less attached to me. Just a quick word from today's sponsor, Huel, and more specifically, Huel Daily Greens, which I love. I have every single morning, and I just feel better. I feel like it's a good part of my routine. I know that I'm getting everything that my body needs, and it tastes nice, and it's quick and easy to set up. Just a bit of water, bit of powder, shake it up, drink. It's a great start to my day, and it contains 91 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced nutrients. So if you have any interest in Daily Greens or any other Huel products, which I recommend, then click the link in the description. Back to this talk.
Certainly, like postponing thinking about things is actually quite a common technique. And it might just be postponing it until later the same day. But so what happens, what we tend to find in psychotherapy is, think of it this way. People underestimate how biased their thinking becomes by different emotional states, right? That this is one of the main mistakes that people make, right? So people get really anxious, and while they're in a heightened anxious state, they'll try to figure out solutions. And so they'll worry about something. They might spend hours and hours lying in the bed at night, think about something when they're in a very anxious state. Now, they kind of forget that the anxiety is biasing their thinking. It's distorting their reasoning, right? So it's like you're constantly feeding more and more information through this negative filter, right? And that's why worrying usually doesn't help us that much. It often just makes us more and more anxious. It kind of causes a spiral. So, for instance, when people are anxious, you imagine your brain is in this different mode of functioning now. We know that anxious people tend to exhibit a thinking error that's sometimes called catastrophizing. And so when people catastrophize, they'll typically exaggerate or overestimate the severity of a threat and also its probability. And they'll also typically underestimate or downplay their coping ability, right? And so if you're constantly wearing those lenses that exaggerate the severity and probability of threat and downplay your coping ability, and you're spending hours from that biased perspective thinking about a problem, you're just going to kind of tie yourself in knots basically and make yourself feel much worse. It'd be better if you could wait until your anxiety has naturally abated and you're feeling more composed, and then you come back and think about the problem. People tend to be more familiar with this in relation to anger, but we use it for anxiety. We also use it for depression. So I think a lot of people realize that when you're really angry, it might not be the best time to try and be assertive, and especially in a relationship, right? So, if your wife has done something that's really kind of triggered you, it might be a good idea to wait until you've calmed down, and then have a conversation with her about it, rather than having a conversation with her about it while you're still really angry. Because, I mean, like, literally, it's easy to imagine, like, when you're really tense and you're angry, you're going to be like doing it through gritted teeth, and your facial expression is and that's going to make it harder to have a constructive conversation, right? And also your thinking is going to be skewed in many. I mean, I think people often just don't realize that we can quantify the biases in thinking, and we can study them. So, for example, when people are anxious, they tend to overestimate risk, typically. When people are angry, they do the opposite and they usually underestimate risk. Angry people are less capable of evaluating the long term consequences of their actions. And for that reason, they often act more impulsively. And then often angry people will do things that they regret afterwards. So, but it seems like the best thing to do at the time because their brain has kind of switched off its ability to think longer term. And so, because of that, they're not really picturing how speaking in a certain way might over time damage their relationship, for instance. It might allow them to get their way in the moment, but then really harm the relationship long term. But their brain doesn't recognize that because it's not able to kind of process that information. Afterwards, they might think, oh, gee, I wish I hadn't done that, right? When they're more composed and their brain is now more able to evaluate the consequences of their actions. But that means that we should learn to manage our own thinking so that we're more selective about the mental state that we're in when we're spending time going over or attempting to solve a problem.
What does that look like? Because I imagine, well, I know that when you're angry or you're anxious, your thinking is directed by that, and oftentimes you're actually not really aware that your actions and your thoughts are being directed by your emotions. Like,
Right?
how can you actually? Um, is there techniques or ways to
Yeah.
become aware?
Yeah. I mean, what we usually do in CBT, in cognitive behavioral therapy, is there's a couple of things. First of all, like other people questioning you will tend to heighten your awareness. So it might actually be that over time your wife or your friends point this out. In reality, that's often what happens, right? Or as a child, it should be your parents. There's an important role played by other people in this, right? You don't have to have, not everyone has friends that are going to tell them, or that they'll listen to. But in reality, when things are going well, like, and we have a healthy social support network, we've got good parenting, like people will draw our attention to the fact that we're being guided by our anxiety or being biased by our anger, right? That's what helps keep us sane, right? Is this kind of input from other people, like sharing their external perspective with us. Or if not, then you go and see a therapist or a coach and they help you, right? But ultimately, you need to be able to find ways to do this on your own as well, even without input from other people. That's the way it often works, and in a sense, that's kind of like the ideal scenario. But not everybody has a therapist or a coach or friends to kind of help them. So what in CBT we'd normally do is, for instance, train people to first of all spot high risk situations or triggers. Like, so you have to be clear about when you lose your temper or become anxious, right? Is it typically in certain times? Is it only ever in social situations? Is it only at work? What are the situations where this typically happens? So being really clear about the type of places, times, the kind of things that are known triggers for you, like having a list in your mind, all right, allows you when you're at work and you're talking to someone in authority, for instance, to now be a little bit more watchful, a little bit more mindful, because I know that typically in these kind of scenarios is where I tend to become socially anxious, let's say, right? Or when somebody brings up a certain subject, you go, I know this kind of triggers my anger, right? So recognizing those things in advance by reviewing your past experience, thinking in the past, what did the situations have in common where I lost my temper, right? Is number one. So identifying high risk situations and external triggers. Number two, spotting what we call early warning signs, right? So if you think of anger as a process, or anxiety, or becoming depressed, like feelings normally wax and wane, or like sometimes they occur in episodes. So you should be able to spot when they're beginning, right? And it might be that there's a particular type of thought that pops into your mind that tends to trigger anxiety. Also, early in the process, there's usually changes in your muscular tension. Um, I mean, the weird thing is, in reality, the first warning sign that many people notice is a change in their facial expression, or they'll be tensing their shoulders or their arms or something like that, or they'll notice the tightness in their chest. So these kind of muscular sensations are usually warning signs that people often are oblivious to. Because when you're angry, you're just engrossed, you have tunnel vision for your anger, right? But someone else watching you would think, that guy's frowning, he's staring, his voice has changed, right? But you're not kind of like keeping an itemization of these things when you're angry.
Yeah.
You're just absorbed in the anger. So, but noticing them will potentially snap you out of it, right? So, noticing, why am I frowning? Like worry and anger both are often associated with frowning. So, just noticing when you begin frowning, or noticing when you begin tensing your shoulders, like for instance, or whatever. You know, everyone's slightly different. Some people notice quite idiosyncratic sensations at the beginning, but there's also ones that are quite stereotypical. Like usually people frown and tense their arms and shoulders, or they feel like in tightness in their chest if it's anxiety. And spotting that at an earlier stage allows you it. It's harder to control emotions the longer they've had to escalate, right? The earlier you catch them, the easier it is to nip them in the bud. And actually, the strange thing is, like, if you imagine that catching them earlier would mean that any strategy that you use is now going to be easier to implement, right? It's easier to do it at the beginning than it is to do once you're already, losing control, right? Better to do it at the beginning of the process before your anger, before your anxiety or worry has escalated. But the strange thing is, most people will, if they catch their anger or anxiety early enough, they'll often find that they don't even need to use another strategy. Like they'll often find that just noticing it earlier is enough to kind of snap them out of it. With anger, I mean, all emotions are different, but anger is an interesting example in this regard because, and this is maybe, I'll kind of mention something else here, a wider issue. That I think one of the problems with self help, another problem with self help, I guess this is like the fifth problem or something.
It's a long list.
I know it's a long list. There's another problem with self help, which is that we we need to understand what an emotion is before we decide what strategies to use to change our emotions, right? And if everybody was wrong about what emotions look like and how they function, then we're all going to be wrong about the techniques that make sense, right? And unfortunately, our society has what psychologists and philosophers call a folk psychology. That's our default set of assumptions about how thinking works, how what the mind is, how it interacts with the body, what emotions are like, right? Our folk psychology, especially with regard to emotion, is incredibly simplistic, right? And it's wrong, right? Basically, it's incorrect, right? And rarely does anyone ever attempt to kind of educate us, to help us arrive at a more informed theory of emotion. So the self-help techniques that we use are typically based on a false premise. Like they're based on a misunderstanding of what emotions look like. So there are many things that I could say about this that relate to Socrates, but one of them, in terms of catching early warning signs, so we tend to think that anxiety and sadness and anger are all just like emotions, they're sort of on a level playing field. But many psychologists believe that anger functions somewhat differently from other emotions in that it seems almost more like a coping strategy in some ways rather than it's sometimes called a secondary emotion rather than a primary emotion, because when we question people about their anger, what we almost always find is that there's another emotion that precedes anger and triggers it. So it can vary. It might be frustration. It's often feeling hurt. So maybe, in a social situation, I might go to shake someone's hand and they turn away from me. And so I kind of, that hurts my self-esteem, right? But I might only feel hurt for a split second before I get angry, right? So anger is often a reaction to anxiety, frustration, emotional hurt. And often it's so quick that we don't even notice the emotion that precedes it, right? So spotting early warning signs in the case of anger functions even better because often what's gone unnoticed is this preceding emotion. And if we can acknowledge the preceding emotion and even just kind of allow ourselves to sit with it for a little bit longer, that kind of slows things down. And even if we just sit with it for another 5 seconds, we might then think, man, that really hurt when that guy turned away from me. But now that I've kind of spent a few more seconds experiencing that, it no longer seems worthwhile getting angry and snapping at him, right? So
Yeah.
just buying a little bit more time. But to do that, we have to be willing to endure the pain slightly longer. And that gives us time to evaluate whether anger seems like it's actually worthwhile or whether it's going to do more harm than good or whatever. Whereas if we just react immediately because we can't stand the pain so much, we just have to get rid of it immediately by becoming angry. So anger kind of distracts us from it. Then we're more likely to act impulsively and do stuff that we regret. So another way of looking for early warning signs with certain types of emotion like anger is to say, what's the feeling that preceded this? And could I just pay more attention to that? What did it actually feel like? What thoughts were going through my mind when I had that preceding emotion? Now, backing up a minute, I said we have this naive view of emotion. Ancient philosophers often showed a more nuanced view of emotion, and I include Socrates in that. So Socrates at times exhibits more of a cognitive understanding of emotion. And obviously cognitive therapy is deeply wedded to the cognitive revolution in psychology and this more cognitive understanding of how emotions work. So by cognition, I mean thoughts and beliefs, right? Albert Ellis, who was the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy in the 1950s, he was very influenced by Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher. And he was one of the pioneers of cognitive behavioral therapy. He developed the earliest form of it, which is called REBT, or Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, in New York. And Ellis, when people said to Ellis, "I can't help it," the getting upset. I just feel angry, right? I can't help how I feel. Ellis would say to them, "Yes, but it's not just how you feel, is it? It's also how you think." And this is a gap in awareness that the majority of people have, right? Most people massively underestimate the extent to which their beliefs and their thinking shapes their emotions. And so, the foundation of cognitive therapy is to get people to become more aware of how their underlying beliefs and their thinking is contributing to their anger or to their anxiety. I touched on this earlier when I said that often when people are anxious, they overestimate the severity and probability of a threat and they underestimate their coping ability. Those are judgments, like appraisal, that thinking, right? So the difference is people who say, well, anxiety is just a feeling, they have what's sometimes called the naive hydraulic model of emotion, right? So for a lot of people, an emotion is just like an energy that builds up in you and it's kind of shapeless almost. Like it's just like, like pressure welling up within us. And so their natural way of thinking, how do you cope with that? What self-help would make sense would be, I don't know, what do you do if anger or anxiety wells up in you like pressure? I guess you can try and push it down, or you could try and distract yourself from it, or you could try and kind of discharge it. So you'll see people going, I have a lot of anger, I try and get it out of my system at the gym or whatever, right? Now, that would make sense if anger was like water pressure building up inside you. Like you could sort of vent it and release the pressure or something, maybe like lancing a boil or something, right? But what if anger is actually caused by certain beliefs and attitudes, right? What if anger, in many cases, is your belief that someone has violated a rule and deserves to be punished as a consequence, right? What if your anger is about believing that someone else has acted inappropriately or unjustly? Yeah. And what if you're wrong about that? Or what if you're exaggerating the severity of it? Or what if you're ignoring other kind of mitigating factors? Like, say someone says something that seems kind of insulting, right? They call you an idiot. They say, that was dumb, right? And you might think, are you saying I'm an idiot? Like, how dare you? You shouldn't insult me. You should respect me. You've violated a rule. You've done something inappropriate, done something that you shouldn't have done, right? You implied that I was stupid. So I might be ignoring the fact that you've been my best friend for years and you've said lots of nice things about me and been really supportive, right? So my thinking is kind of selective and biased, and maybe I'm misinterpreting what you meant as well, right? In order to get angry. So there might be all sorts of biases, right? And errors in my reasoning. But I'm not going to be able to evaluate those until I recognize that my anger is how I think, right? Because if it's just a feeling, feelings are neither true nor false. That's why people say it's just how I feel, right? And else would say it's not just how you feel, though, it's also how you think. And your thoughts might be wrong, right? Your thoughts might be distorted, exaggerated, selective, right? So cognitive therapy is all about helping us to identify that. Socrates recognized that anger was caused by beliefs. And, he passed this insight on to the Stoics, and the Stoics passed it on to cognitive therapy. So this is how philosophy becomes wedded to psychotherapy, because by asking questions, like by using reason, we can help people to reevaluate the beliefs and values that are causing them to feel anger or anxiety or sadness, and to change their attitudes, change their philosophy of life in a way that might change the emotions that they're experiencing as a result. That's why Socrates is a cognitive therapist. And I'll flesh that out a little bit by saying sometimes Socrates talks to intellectuals, like the sophists or other philosophers, about quite abstract things. But in some of the dialogues, particularly in some of Xenophon's dialogues, so our two main sources are Plato's dialogues and Xenophon's dialogues, both two students of Socrates whose writings survive today. In Xenophon's dialogues in particular, Socrates is sometimes just talking to friends or family members about how they're really annoyed he talks to his teenage son Lamprocles about how the boy is really annoyed with his mum. He finds his mum really irritating and annoying, right? Because she nags him a lot. And Socrates questions him about his anger towards his mum. Now, that's the sort of dialogue that I'm particularly thinking of when I say Socrates is a proto-cognitive therapist. Like, that dialogue really looks like he's doing some sort of relationships counselling or cognitive therapy with his son. And as he has a similar discussion with two of his best friends, Chaerephon and Cheirecrates, they're called, two brothers, and they fall out over their inheritance. And Socrates helps them to kind of resolve this conflict by questioning them. So he's not doing the really abstract philosophy all the time. Like, often he's using the Socratic method and his questioning technique to get people to question the attitudes and beliefs that are making them angry or experiencing other negative emotions.
So something interesting you're talking about not understanding emotions. Just something to add is until recently, maybe early to mid 20s, I genuinely believed that I didn't experience anger. I didn't think I had any anger in me,
Uh-huh.
and this false belief just caused numerous problems in my life. Um, so I put in the day I kind of understood better my emotions. I was like, oh, I do have anger. I just don't have a clue how to express it or
Yeah.
how it works.
It's very common, actually. It's more, I mean, there are many things that people in general underestimate about psychology. One of them is there are lots of people who find it difficult to articulate their emotions, who maybe don't really distinguish between different emotions as clearly as they might. I mean, there'll be clients that come. What often happens, for example, is often clients will turn up in therapy or coaching, and they'll talk about how they're feeling stressed. Now, that's almost like a euphemism, right? Because and sometimes the therapist has to really kind of dig to try and figure out stressed as in like you want to cry, stressed as in you want to punch somebody, like stressed as in you're thinking of killing yourself. Like, I mean, what, like that could mean anything, right? So we're talking about anger, we're talking about fear, we're talking about sadness, some combination thereof, some other emotion, but stress is such a vague term. That's one of the ways in which people will articulate emotion in a way that's not helping them, and that makes it hard for them to communicate with other people because it's not specific enough to be able to kind of really distinguish it from other, ways of thinking or feeling. If that's all you know about someone, that they're just feeling stressed, you can't really help them, right? Because, like, are they angry or sad or scared or what? Like, how would we even know where to begin? Like, if we don't know which one of those they're experiencing, right? And equally, even anxiety, in our folk psychology, we don't even distinguish between different types of anxiety very much. But in clinical practice, we have to, because panic attacks are not the same as animal phobias. Like, you can have both, but they're two different things and they respond to different treatments. Generalized anxiety disorder is different again from a phobia. It responds to a different type of treatment. PTSD, like anxiety, is more in response to memories or trauma in the past. So it functions in a different way in response to a different sort of treatment. And yet, the general public in our folk psychology, we just tend to talk about anxiety and or fear and just lump all these things together. So how can we even begin unless we start to distinguish between the different forms that they take? And then even within anxiety to think, what is it? Is it just this kind of amorphous feeling? Or does anxiety consist of certain beliefs? Does it consist in certain ways of behaving, as well as certain physiological processes and sensations that are going on within us? Anxiety, I like to say anxiety is a cake that's baked from lots of different ingredients. It's like there's a recipe for it, right? I mean, it's made from a bunch of stuff. And we have to know what those ingredients are, before we can begin changing it. Maybe instead of baking a cake, we could bake a loaf of bread if we changed what the ingredients when the recipe said, right? So if we want to take our anxiety and turn it into healthy concern, if we want to take anger and turn it into assertiveness, we need to understand what the recipe is that we've been following in order to make the anger, right? It's a composite made of a bunch of different things. But if we just think of it as a kind of blob of energy, it's a non-starter. It's almost like it leaves us just sitting there scratching our heads, like thinking, I don't know what this thing is called anger. So how would I even begin to know how to deal with it? I'll give you an example. So I think a good way to illustrate that is if you say anger is caused by believing that somebody has transgressed a rule and deserves to be punished, for instance, in some cases. How the hell would going to the gym and getting it out of your system by punching a bag make any difference at all to the underlying beliefs and attitudes that you have that made you angry in the first place? Right? So there are loads of influencers that say the way to deal with anger is to just kind of vent it. Research on venting, by the way, shows that it doesn't really work. Right? But still, if people think of anger as an energy, it seems plausible to them that you should be able to get it out of your system. How would that change the beliefs? If you have a sense of entitlement, so that if you ask a woman out on a date and she rejects you, you become furiously enraged with her. How would going to the gym change that feeling of entitlement? Those attitudes, those demands that made you prone to anger in the first place. It's not going to make one whit of difference, right, to the things that actually caused your anger. What would? Well, being able to kind of recognize and admit what the values and beliefs and demands are that made you feel angry, and then questioning them, asking yourself, what's the consequence of thinking this way? Do other people think this way about rejection? Other alternative ways that I could view it? What are the pros and cons of believing that I'm entitled to for to have somebody accept me when I ask them out on a date? Questioning the beliefs that we have, but that it's painful to do that. Like we said at the beginning about Socrates being willing to kind of accept the pain and this discomfort of being proven wrong. Many people would just rather have their ego massaged and have their biases reinforced which is the worst kind of self help is the kind that just kind of caters to that, like, and encourages people's biases and unhealthy coping strategies.
Do you think that going to the gym? Because I've heard that advice loads, especially with like breakups. Like, just go to the gym, work out, and it'll sort out all your problems. Do you think it is a good tool for distancing? Because if you're wrapped up in the emotions of the problem, it's hard to like we said, it's hard to kind of think
Yeah,
rationally about it. But then if you do go for a run or get to the gym, maybe half an hour in, you're in a kind of a different frame of mind, maybe because you've got endorphins and
I think, to be clear, I think it has a number of psychological benefits to do exercise. There's no question about that, right? But nevertheless, like, it doesn't directly address the beliefs and attitudes
yeah,
that cause your problems, right? And so sometimes it can constitute a form of avoidance, right? So what going to the gym might do is temporarily alleviate the unpleasant feelings associated with anger, like, but it doesn't actually do anything to change the beliefs and attitudes that are associated with anger. So therefore, it's actually just like a band-aid. Like, it's masking the pain of the problem without really changing anything fundamental about it. But there are, like, benefits to be had. There are definitely benefits, particularly in relation to depression.
yeah,
Um, Consistent exercise can be useful, not as a way of kind of venting, like, but it can benefit us in other ways. And actually, like you said, I mean, I think also if you go to if I'm running or like even like walking or something, just being more active and sometimes thinking about problems in that frame of mind while you're engaged in an activity can help you gain distance and view things more objectively. Thinking about problems in any alternative state of mind is potentially helpful. Anything that helps you be more flexible and experience problems from different perspectives could be useful. So exercise sometimes can definitely contribute positively to that.
okay. Because you see it in films a lot. There'll be a character who's got certain problems, and they'll say, how do you deal with it? It says, I just go boxing once a day. It's like they've been doing that for 20 years. I feel like in those 20 years, they could have addressed the actual problem that they're avoiding.
Yeah, like, I mean it. So in some cases, like I say, I mean, you can definitely see, for example, if boxing got anger out of your system, there would be no angry boxers, right? And
Yeah,
there are definitely some boxers that have anger issues, right? Not all of them, but some of them do, right? It's not just simply purging all the anger out of your system. They do a lot of that. It doesn't necessarily cure them. So, I mean, like I said, for some people, doing exercise can just be a distraction strategy. It does no more really to benefit them than watching a movie or reading a book would. It temporarily kind of alleviates the discomfort, but doesn't really not only not change their attitudes, but also doesn't kind of change their typical ways of coping. So, say, in addition to me imposing demands on other people that are maybe unreasonable, that's not going to change by me going to the gym and punching a bag or whatever. But also, if somebody offends me, and my typical way of responding to that is to swear at them and insult them, right? Then that way of acting isn't necessarily going to be changed by going to the gym. It'll make me feel better temporarily, but 2 days later, if somebody says something that riles me again, I'm maybe going to swear at them and shout at them. And that might be, a foolish thing to do, say, in a work setting. It could get me fired from my job. Like,
yeah,
if I find that, I'm prone to act in an aggressive way. Or even just in a relationship, my wife might leave me, like, if I am verbally abusive or even violent towards her. Like, so the propensity to kind of exhibit these dysfunctional behaviors, like these bad ways of coping, isn't going to be helped really that much by going and doing exercise and things like that.
yeah. I thought something was interesting because we're talking about anger. Is it, yeah, so I'm sure it's in your book because it's on my mind. You're talking about you can be angry at your enemy, but then normally it's actually your loved ones that experience your anger. Also,
Yeah.
it's hard to like just if you're angry, you're angry. It's not like you can kind of choose where it's
Yeah.
directed.
There are many puzzles about anger. It's one of my favourite subjects, as maybe you can tell, because we used it a few times as an example. Although my specialism is in treating anxiety, so we could talk a lot about anxiety as well. But yeah, people are probably more often in modern society angry with their loved ones. So it's funny because when we talk about anger, we usually actually, I notice in textbooks and stuff, when psychologists talk about anger, often they automatically think that anger has to do with how you respond to your enemies. But usually we're more commonly angry with our friends and our loved ones, I would say, in my experience. And then as a therapist, um, it's usually my clients are talking to me about anger issues that they have towards their kids or their wife, for instance, or sometimes their friends or their own parents, let's say, not really enemies as such. So there's something kind of paradoxical about that. But there are many, many interesting paradoxes about the nature of anger. I mean, one is anger is a state of mind in which people, you know, often do things that make their problems worse. Like it's a kind of paradoxical frame of mind. And usually afterwards, when we've calmed down, we think, oh, that just added to the problem, like the way that I behaved when I was angry. But there are a lot of things that we could say about it. We mentioned that people that are angry underestimate risk. They tend to have a kind of tunnel vision. They tend to feel, normally when you're coping with a problem and you're in a calm and a rational state of mind, you'll usually think, well, I've got several options here. I could do this, I could do that, I could wait a while and then do something else. I could get someone to help me do this instead. Right. So usually there's a kind of variety of options that we have in front of us, and we're kind of choosing between them or we're combining several. You'll notice that when people feel angry, they often speak as if they feel they only have one option. Right. You didn't give me any choice but to yell at you. They'll say stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
So they often have this weird sense of being locked into one strategy, right? Like, I had to do this. You made me do this. And the other thing about anger, and one of the reasons I'm interested in it, angry people are therapy dodgers. Like the anxious people and depressed people tend to read self-help books and they come and have therapy and they try to help themselves. But anger, when we get angry, we protect ourselves. We protect our ego by blaming other people, right? And so an angry person typically thinks that you need therapy, not me. Like everyone else needs therapy. So angry people don't typically self-refer for therapy. Someone who's anxious or depressed comes to therapy, they might go, I also have some anger. Or they come to therapy because they say their wife told them they have to come, for instance. But fewer angry people are just naturally inclined to seek therapy because they usually blame other people for their problems.
Yeah.
And that's partly why anger, in a sense, is I'm tempted to say it's the most social or antisocial of the emotional problems. In a sense, it is, because anger is very obviously bound up with things like cyberbullying, the way that people behave online, political extremism, like extremely partisan political views. Like, so we see a lot of anger today online, and angry. Again, it's not just a feeling; it's a way of thinking. So we see people kind of exhibiting these cognitive biases. Being very locked into one perspective, being very selective in their thinking, going to extremes in their thinking, like online, especially when it gets into discussions of politics. Like they're looking at the world through angry lenses, and angry lenses are not very good for problem solving.
I think you see that a lot with self-help. I've heard you. I remember listening to a podcast where you're talking about the subject is with angry people, is they'll hear some self-help advice, not pointing out their anger. They'll point out, they'll point the finger at who's causing their anger. So it's
Mm-hmm.
either like women are causing their anger, or a different
Yeah,
political party or something's causing their
yeah,
anger. So rather than, like you said, no one's going to go, I've got anger issues, let's address that. They just start to pointing the finger at someone else.
Yeah, they typically blame other people, and so it can be what the one reason for that is that when people are anxious or sad, their attention in a sense is more turned inward and on themselves. When we get angry, our attention shifts dramatically to an outward focus. Now that temporarily alleviates the pain that we felt. So I say I'm at a dinner party and somebody snubs me and it really hurts my feelings. But if I now get really angry with them, that shifts all of my attention outward. And so it distracts me from the pain and hurt that I was feeling, right? So again, it's like a band-aid. It's a distraction technique, right? So that's one of the reasons that people do it kind of compulsively. Like they're desperately doing it without realizing as a way of masking their initial feeling of hurt. Like it takes that pain away because it gives us something else to focus on over there instead of
Yeah.
inside, right? Um, but it's not healthy because it prevents us from kind of processing. There's what we sometimes call just natural emotional processing that goes on. If I feel hurt because somebody seems to snub me, I might want to spend some time just processing that and thinking, well, am I sure that they really did it on purpose? Like, is it really that big a deal in the grand scheme of things? Maybe have I done similar things in the past? Like, there might be perspectives that would cause me to kind of balance or mitigate like the amount of distress that I feel. But I don't give myself any time to chew it over or kind of like reappraise it. If I immediately think, oh, that hurts, I'm going to shift all my attention onto this guy and what a jerk he is. Like, and so that I'm not thinking about this pain anymore. Like, I'm just thinking about ways that I could get back at him now.
Uh,
Like, so it prevents me from doing the healing work.
is that healing basically when you become aware of it, have that dialogue with yourself, of just sort of like you said, if someone insults you, go, did they mean it, or am I insulted because it's true, or any like you sort of have a dialogue with yourself to get to the core of it.
Yeah, I mean, normally that's what happens. Like when we experience an unpleasant emotion, there's usually a little process we go through of kind of reappraising it and kind of reflecting on it. If that goes on too long, it can become unhealthy.
Right.
But
Yeah.
if it goes on for like a few minutes or something like that, that's pretty normal. And we start to think, oh, that really hurt my feelings, but maybe he didn't mean it, right? Or maybe I took it the wrong way, or maybe like he's just doing that because I did something earlier that offended him or something like that, right? So there's just a normal rational process of kind of trying to figure out, like, look at it from a few different perspectives. And actually, like, a reasonable normal response would be to say there's some uncertainty here, there's some ambiguity here, and to be tolerant of that, right? So normal response would be to go, I'm not really sure whether that was intentional or not, right? And I'm not like 100% sure whether maybe he took offense at something that I did earlier, like, so that you might think, I could see it this way, I could see it that way. Like, I don't know for sure what the right interpretation is. That's like a normal response. But to do that requires something that psychologists call tolerance of uncertainty, right? And people who exhibit a high degree of intolerance of uncertainty tend to be more prone to pathological emotions such as anxiety and depression. Like, so this is something also that the Socratic method, I think, trains us to do, is to be more open-minded, to have more cognitive flexibility, to be more willing to like tolerate ambiguity or uncertainty in our thinking. And often when we talk about developing these skills, it sounds like we're trying to get from here to there. Like, but really it's more like we're just trying to get back to what's normal. It's normal to tolerate uncertainty in our thinking. Like, how did we ever get to a point where we found that intolerable? Like, of course, it's neurotic, like, to think that you have to latch on to one interpretation or another with absolute certainty because you can't read other people's minds. So usually, like, there's some uncertainty about what's going on in relationships. Like normal psychological functioning has to tolerate that, and therefore has to be open to a number of different possibilities. Right? We live in an ambiguous world. Like unless you're neurotic, and then you demand certainty from every situation, right? And usually, the certainty that you'll latch onto is kind of the worst case scenario if you're not careful. Like, and so that you can drive yourself crazy that way.
Yeah, I think I definitely for a long time struggled with that, just zero flexibility and things, well, either this or that. And I'll just explain one thing about that, and then I will get to a question I should have started the whole talk with. Probably an important question.
Uh huh.
But I used to sort of think, we are just talking about emotions, and my sort of emotional like display, or however it seemed to me, was either I'm okay
Uh-huh.
or things aren't okay and I have to escape. Like that's kind of all I really felt, and I never knew. I didn't know if it was anger, sadness, or anything. It was
Mm-hmm.
kind of like things are okay, things aren't okay. I need to get away from this situation, and that's just the way I understood the world until very recently. Until I did work and had a mentor and uh, learn about emotions and that. But I'll get to the question that should have started this all with is what makes Socrates so important or so impactful that philosophy is broken down into Socratic, pre-Socratic?
Well, one way of answering that, the way that people used to answer that in the ancient world, right? And again, there's some ambiguity here, right? It's not really the whole story, but the typical thing that people actually said about Socrates in the past was there were philosophers before Socrates, but they didn't apply the method of dialectic. So the Socratic method, the question and answer method, as it's known, they didn't apply that method of questioning things to everyday ethical problems, right? So, for instance, one group was one of the main groups that preceded Socrates, probably the dominant group from the previous generation, were natural philosophers, and they would debate about the nature of the heavens, what the stars were, whether there were people living on the moon. They debated what caused earthquakes and what caused thunder. So they were proto scientists, and they used like a kind of rational questioning method, but they didn't apply it to moral questions that were directly relevant to everyday life. So people used to say Socrates brought philosophy down from the heavens. Like, and the other way they express that is they use this line, kind of slightly cryptic line from Homer, I think it's from the Odyssey, and it refers to dealing with what's good or evil within your house. And this is their kind of figurative way of expressing what Socrates did. He started to get people to question what their fundamental values were in relation to like their everyday life, what was happening in their own home, with their family, with their friends, right? Particularly actually in Xenophon, I think you see this kind of mundane aspect of it. It's like this almost like I said earlier, this kind of cognitive therapy aspect of what Socrates is doing. And so that really inspired a lot of people. So philosophy was no longer just for ivory tower academics. It was something that was relevant to everybody, potentially. The other thing that I think Plutarch says, Socrates applied philosophy to every aspect of our lives. You see him, for like I mentioned earlier, him philosophizing with military generals about what constitutes courage, right? So like every kind of like aspect of like Socrates would be questioning, like what fundamentally is that you value. What's the goal here? How do you define that? Is this a question about justice? What is justice? How would you define that? Is that definition consistent, or do you contradict it in some situations? And he would get us to spot contradictions that are of real practical importance. I'll give you another example that's really, again, from Xenophon. Socrates is speaking to a young man called Critobulus. He's probably about 15, and he's the son of one of Socrates' best friends, Crito. And he wants Socrates to introduce him to influential people. Socrates knows everybody. And he says, look, I want you to basically help me with networking, essentially, is what he's saying. So I want to meet people that would be good friends. And Socrates says, well, what is a good friend? Could you define what you mean by that? And Critobulus is able to give a definition of what a good friend would be like. It's kind of pretty banal stuff, like, if I was sick, they'd come and visit me. If I was broke, maybe they'd lend me money. Maybe they'd also question my behavior if I was acting inappropriately. They'd give me some perspective and stuff. But then Socrates flips it round. So Socrates usually starts off with a question that's easy to answer, and then he turns it round so it becomes more challenging. So he says to Critobulus, how many of these qualities do you actually exhibit yourself? And Critobulus says, well, like, I don't know, like not very many of them. None, maybe, I don't know. And Socrates says, well, you had this whole conversation back to front. You asked me how I could introduce you to people who are good friends. And to do that, I'd have to kind of portray you as being a good friend. So maybe I'd be misleading them, right? And that's not going to work out that well for you or for me. They're not going to trust me anymore as a sort of matchmaker of friends. Wouldn't it have made more sense for you to ask me how you could become a good friend? So one of the slogans that's attributed to Socrates is the idea that we should be as we wish to appear. He's saying to Critobulus, you want to appear to other people as a good friend. It would be better for you to ask me how you could actually become, in reality, a good friend. Because you're exhibiting what cognitive psychologists call a double standard, right? So, right at a practical level, in terms of what you understand a friend to be, you apply one standard to other people, a different standard to yourself.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of hypocrisy or a contradiction in your moral thinking. Not about in some weird abstract sense, but about something that's really mundane and really practical in every day of your life. You're thinking inconsistently, and it's affecting the way that you interact with the people you meet and the way that you view friendship.
I think there's a similar with the brothers about him wanting his brother to be a good brother, but then I believe Socrates was questioning him, like, well, are you being a good brother?
Yeah.
And it did fix their relationship.
This is Socrates doesn't explicitly state it in the way that you find in Christian literature, but he definitely implies something that we call the golden rule. So in the New Testament it says you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And famously, this kind of advice occurs in similar, slightly different forms in many different world religions and different philosophical traditions, but it's definitely there in the Socratic dialogues. And it's there in the Socratic dialogues for an obvious reason, because Socrates is all about pointing out contradictions in people's thinking, and this kind of moral double standard that is an example of a contradiction. So someone who's resolved these double standards and contradictions would be more likely to be living in accord with the golden rule, treating other people the way that they would want to be treated themselves, like, exhibiting the type of friendship that they would expect and like from other people. But Socrates says something interesting about it. He says that he kind of says to Socrates and other people as well that he's talking to about and having similar conversations with, he sort of says you should go first, right? So you should be willing to act first as you would like other people to act, and then they'll be more likely to reciprocate. And if they don't, you haven't really lost anything. Like, you've just kind of demonstrated that you're the better person. But you should always, like, if you think that's what a good friend would do, if you think that's what a moral person, someone of integrity would do, like, you should exhibit that behavior. It's something that you value.
Yeah. So I'm just looking over here because I've had to write the names down of people from the book, because I can't. Reading your book is the first time I've heard most of these names, so it's hard to remember them. A story that came to mind, and I remember reading this. I believe you made a post about it years ago about Socrates, but it's always stood out in my mind. And then obviously you wrote it in your book, is when he walks out into the field. He just walks out and he's stood there and he stands there for like 24 hours. Can you describe that story? Because I've always found it really interesting.
It's in Plato's Symposium, and it's Alcibiades, Socrates' friend, that describes observing this when they were on military campaign together. Um, and Socrates, we're told that he had a tendency to do this at other times as well. It wasn't like a completely one-off thing. But in this particular instance, he stood for 24 hours. I think it was from sunrise one day until sunrise the next day that we're told he stood in the military camp, and the other soldiers camped beside him because they couldn't believe what he was doing. So they wanted to kind of observe him and see if he would move. And he just kind of froze in some kind of contemplation. Some people think that he had a kind of psychiatric condition or some other kind of medical explanation for it. It's somewhat cryptic, right? But it could just be that he was. I think the implication that's made by Plato is that he was, engrossed in philosophical contemplation, and he concludes by saying a prayer to the rising sun, and then he just carries on as if nothing had happened. But yeah, Socrates, we have to imagine he wasn't like a modern academic philosopher. Like, he dedicated his life to engaging in rigorous philosophical debate about down to earth, therapeutic, practical issues all day long, every day, right? Even to the point at which it would get quite heated, and sometimes people supposedly attack him in the street. And then sometimes he would just be completely absorbed. I mean, he was a guy who was absolutely like, he thought doing philosophy is the most important thing. It's what gives life meaning. Like, and he exemplified that life. Like, he was totally committed. He also tells us, we're told, Plato says that when Socrates had finished debating philosophy with his friends, he'd go home and continue the process in private in his imagination. He'd have these imaginary kind of hypothetical debates going on in his mind.
Well, yeah, because I remember when he heard the message from the oracle. I can't remember what you call the message, but it's sort of like he became obsessed. Like, the gods have put this upon him to figure
Yeah.
out, and that became his life mission.
Well, this is actually leads into maybe a different sort of question about writing the biography of Socrates. The oracle's pronouncement's a good example. It's probably one of the most famous events in Socrates' life, because in Plato's Apology, Plato has Socrates say that this was a kind of seminal moment that shaped his philosophy, inspired him. He tells that he kind of gives this little explanation about how he went off and thought, I need to find out if there's anyone that is wiser than me in order to put this oracle to the test. The oracle said, no man is wiser than Socrates. So Socrates thought, that can't be true. Like, there must be someone wiser than me. So I'll go around everybody that's got a reputation for wisdom, and I'll interrogate them or question them. Like, and then he found that when he did that, like, they always ended up contradicting themselves. So proved that they weren't really wise. And he failed to find a genuine wise man, and so he concluded, maybe in a paradoxical sense, I'm wiser than other people because I realize at least that I'm not truly wise. Whereas they believe that they're wise but aren't. At least I know that I'm not wise, he said. So at least I'm not conceited. At least I don't presume that I have wisdom. But we don't know when this happened, and being able to date it would potentially change the way that we interpret the other key events in his life. And some modern scholars even think that the whole story might be completely fictional. I think that's unlikely, but there are classicists that think this is fictional. It's just made up. It didn't really happen at all. So that's one of the problems. If we were to write an academic biography of Socrates, we'd say, well, some people say this, and here's the evidence that suggests that it might have happened, and here's other evidence that would suggest it might be fabricated. But in order to just tell the story like in a dramatized version, in a more engaging way, we need to come down on one side or the other, right? And I think, this is the version of Socrates' life that most people are familiar with. It's integral to the literary character of Socrates. So I thought, we can't leave this out, right? So in order to tell the story of Socrates, I had to kind of suspend questions about the real historical Socrates and just allow myself to tell the story more of the literary character of Socrates, which in a sense is more important, because everything that we know about Socrates' philosophy pretty much is kind of related to the story we're told about his character, whether or not it's 100% historically accurate. Generations, 100, 200, 300 years later in the ancient world, it was this literary character of Socrates, the anecdotes about Socrates that they were responding to. The Stoics knew Socrates mainly through these anecdotes rather than what he was actually like as a real historical individual. So that was part of the challenge. Was I think these ambiguities and these gaps in the story prevented people from being able to just enjoy the legend of Socrates, as it were, right? So I had to kind of bite the bullet and go, okay, I'm just going to kind of set all these uncertainties aside, leave them to the academics, and just say this is what the story looks like, though, as it's handed down to us, and tell it in a more kind of engaging way.
I mean, I think you did a perfect job. I find it really engaging and interesting. I'm just trying to read my handwriting. There's a woman that Socrates met, and I can't remember her name, and I can't even read what I've wrote. But I've never heard of her, and she sounds like a really interesting character. Is what you wrote accurate to this person?
So I think you're talking about Aspasia, right?
Yes.
Or Aspasia, depending how we want to put it. There's multiple ways sometimes of pronouncing the names, whether it's the anglicized version of how it's pronounced in Greek. So Aspasia is the anglicized pronunciation. She's a real historical individual. She was a courtesan, possibly the wife of Pericles. She's portrayed by Plato as being somebody who's adept at rhetoric, almost similar to like a sophist or a philosopher. She's a female intellectual, but we don't know that much about her. One of our main sources, potentially, is that in Plato's Symposium, Socrates tells a story about another woman called Diotima, who's a priestess who taught him a kind of philosophical method and something about the art of love. Some scholars believe that Diotima is a kind of is Aspasia, basically.
Okay. Yeah.
And so that's how I chose to interpret that.
Yeah.
Because it's easier to tell the story if we combine the two figures together, basically. Because what we have is we've got some historical details about this real woman Aspasia, but we don't know that much about what she actually said to Socrates. But she was definitely associated with Socrates. We don't know that much about the nature of their association. But we know quite a lot about what this character Diotima said, but we've no idea, but there's no other references to her in ancient literature. So we don't know who she was or if she's a fictional character. So if it's true that we have this philosophical content and we have this historical figure and they both relate to the same person, we kind of have like some historical information about them and also some description of the stuff they believed. And so we have more rounded character that way. But that's definitely a highly contentious point. So things like that I usually put in the footnotes. There are some scholars that believe that this is the same person, but others think it's not.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first time I've really read about her, and I found her really interesting. In my interpretation, I feel like without her conversation with Socrates, then I don't think he would have. Well, he probably would have some other way, but it didn't seem like he would have made as much progress in the way he was.
There's some puzzles about things like that. So in the symposium, having said that Socrates was inspired to become a philosopher because the pronouncement of the oracle at Delphi, Plato elsewhere in the symposium, that's what he says in the Apology. Then in the symposium, Socrates describes having a conversation with Diotima, and he implies that it happened quite early on in his life. He gives some hints about the date. And then what he describes her doing seems like pretty similar to the Socratic method, right? So one way of reading that is to say, are you suggesting that you learned the Socratic method from this woman early on in your life? But then how does that fit in with the stuff that you said about learning the method from or developing it in response to what the oracle said to you? So potentially we have two slightly conflicting accounts of how Socrates developed his philosophical method. And when that's happened, what I've tried to do is kind of think of ways that potentially they could be combined. Maybe the contradiction is just kind of superficial, and perhaps both could be true. Um, but yeah, like she seems to employ a question and answer method that applies philosophy to the question of love and what that means. And so, if that's true, and it did happen, uh, 10 years before the plague of Athens, I think, is when Plato implies that occurred. That would have had a profound effect on the development of Socrates' philosophy.
Sounds like an interesting figure. Um, Something I'm noticing a lot. I noticed it hugely with the Stoics, but I see it a lot in the philosophers. But it's written in your book is that the goal of philosophy is to rehearse dying.
Yeah.
Um, why?
Well, that's a really good question. It's certainly a theme in a lot of ancient philosophy. I don't know if I have a good answer to it, but I have a partial answer to it. It seems to me that one of the main problems that ancient philosophy wrestles with is the fact that we tend to have the wrong values. We inherit values from our society. And so society kind of dupes us into placing too much importance on reputation and wealth and stuff like that. And what is it that could possibly have the power to snap us out of that? Well, it seems often, but not always, but in many cases, when people have a brush with death, or sometimes if they're bereaved, it makes them radically question the importance of wealth and reputation and other similar things. So one reason that I think contemplating death is important is it seems somehow, for some reason, to be a way of snapping us out of this default perspective that we're born into, whereby we accept the prevailing values of our society. I mean, many people when they're lying on their deathbed or when they have a brush with death will think, in retrospect, was it really that important to pursue, material wealth in the way that I did? So the Stoics and Socrates seem to think, it's a good idea to contemplate our own mortality well in advance. Don't wait until the end of your life to get this epiphany. Like, you could have it now by contemplating your own mortality and thinking about the implications that it has. If that allows you to snap out of it and realize that material possessions aren't the meaning of life, maybe reputation isn't, all important, like, then that's something you'd be better off figuring out at the beginning of your life rather than at the end, right? I mean, I think there are many people that lie in their deathbed and think they spent their entire life pursuing completely the wrong goals, and that's quite tragic, So that's one reason I think it's important for philosophers to contemplate their own mortality. It's a way of helping them to snap out of this default perspective about the goal of life.
Yeah, you made me think. I remember reading, I think it was The Voice of Knowledge, maybe that book. But he was talking about having a near death experience. And then in that experience, he sort of became present in life and realized all these other things, these, like you say, reputation, wealth, were just kind of lies he was telling himself. Um, and uh, I think, yeah, if you can, like, obviously you can't just reenact a near-death experience, but if you can contemplate death and meditate on death like the Stoics do, you can sort of have that realization and understand what's actually important.
Yeah, definitely. And this is definitely something that many people take from Socrates, from the Phaedo. Like, Socrates talks about this a lot. He says philosophers are half dead. He's kind of almost joking about this. But also, in the most famous Socratic dialogue is Plato's Apology, by far the most influential. And in it we see Socrates in the shadow light of his own execution. Like, he's in court, facing the prospect of death, and giving an example of somebody who's unafraid of death, and he's even talking in the court about and even explaining his fearlessness in the face of death. So that had a big impact on ancient philosophy. People found that inspiring. Like Epictetus, when he says people are not upset by things, but rather by their opinions about them. In the next sentence, he said, for example, death itself is not terrifying, for if it was, it would have seemed so to Socrates. And so he refers to the Apology and the fact that Socrates seemed unafraid of dying as his main example of how our fears are a product of our beliefs.
Okay, I'll leave one question. Are you planning on writing another book like the Marcus Aurelius one or like Socrates one? And if so, can you say who it's on?
No, sometimes people ask me about that, but I don't have a plan at the moment. Maybe one day I will, but I don't at the moment have a plan to write another book. It's pretty demanding, and I don't think there's that many historical figures that kind of would lend themselves to this kind of interdisciplinary treatment. So I think I might. I don't have a plan at the moment. The next book I want to write actually is about anger, and then I might write a book about Epictetus, but not in this kind of format. So yeah, I'm open to the idea, but I haven't settled on a good example of somebody. Do you have someone in mind that you think?
I mean, I would, because I don't know too much, but I'd like you said at the start, a book that you would just want. I would like one of these on an Eastern philosopher.
Oh, that'd be cool. Yeah,
I think it would be really cool, especially because I feel like there's less information and less.
Yeah.
And it's a lot different. I think that would be really cool.
Yeah,
I don't know enough
if you could pull that about Eastern philosophy. It's not my sphere.
Oh, actually, you wrote that in your acknowledgement, didn't you? That you thought it would be impossible to write this book.
Yeah, I did think it would be impossible to write.
You think it's impossible to do one on an Eastern philosopher? It might just be possible.
Be wrong.
Yeah,
I might be proven wrong.
Okay. Well, I look forward to your next book. I always talk about your books. I think something I just say about your books is normally I really like them because they're so full of useful information, and I see them as a good source for the best information. But these ones in particular, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, How to Think Like Marcus Aurelius, and How to Think Like Socrates is it's full of all that information, but it's also just a really well written story. And in my head, like I would love loads of these. So
awesome. I'm glad you liked the story. I really enjoyed doing the audiobook as well, actually.
Oh, I haven't heard the audiobook. Maybe I can listen to it. It's a tiring process.
Oh yeah, it's a lot of hard work.
Yeah, it's fun. But thank you very much for your time, Donald.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I enjoy talking to you, and I feel like I could just go on forever.
Well, it's been great. And I hope your audience, your followers, enjoy our conversation as well.
I'm sure they will. This was requested, so.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Today's lesson was powered by Huel. If you, like me and many other people around the world, just living busy lives, struggle to get in your daily nutrition, then Huel Black Edition is a game changer. Most products that support daily nutrition are just packed full of low quality ingredients, but not Huel Black Edition. Each serving delivers 40 grams of plant-based protein, along with 26 essential vitamins and minerals, all carefully selected by Huel's expert nutritionists. Huel Black Edition also supports energy, recovery, focused digestion, and your immune system without the need for extra supplements or spending unnecessary time and money. I implement Huel into my daily life, especially the daily greens each morning, because I like them as part of my routine. I like the taste, I like the health benefits that I feel, and it's quick, easy, and it stops me reaching for those unhealthy snacks and spending unnecessary money and time on unhealthy snacks. and fulfilling these cravings. But don't just take my word for it. People like Idris Elba, Diary of a CEO Stephen Bartlett, and Russ Cook, the first guy to run across the full length of Africa, they all use Huel as part of their daily routine. So if you're ready to invest in your health, go to the link in the description for exclusive offers such as signing up for their subscription service, which will get you 10% off all future orders. And if it's your first time ordering, you get a free shaker and t-shirt. Thank you for listening to today's video. I hope this lesson was helpful. And I do believe in you. I believe in everyone. I do believe that you can change your life and your mindset and the way you're living.